Hello and welcome to Into the Unknown. The historic UFO case of the Reed family was assigned a classification of CE4, Close Encounter of the Fourth Kind, with a case category of 3, Physical Evidence. The case has many layers and is deeply entwined and remains one of the few CE4 cases to be mentioned within the walls of the United Nations. The evidence in this case would include a significant amount of radiation and strong magnetic fields, and is one of a few to have been collected and documented by those in law enforcement. It includes a history of testimony gleaned from conscious recollections, an abundance of documentation, administrative testing and official reports, followed by dark consequences. The history involves Marion Burroughs, grandmother, Nancy Reed, the mother, and the two brothers Tom and Matthew. In the quaint town of Sheffield, Massachusetts in the 1960s, Thomas, aged 6, and his younger brother Matthew experienced life-altering events. Due to their vulnerable age, these encounters had an enormous impact on them, crushing their belief system and denying the two boys of their reality, normality and spirit. Both have conscious memories of the lengthy experiences with non-human entities and being taken aboard a tarnished circular-looking vessel where an image of a willow tree was displayed and still remains embedded in the mind of Thomas to this day. During an autumn evening in Massachusetts, and after a barrage of bright bursts of light, a flash fired through their bedroom window. Tom was engulfed and Matthew was now speaking to an empty bed. An odd stillness accompanied the light and seemed to be what left their mother, Nancy, and their grandmother Marion in a cataleptic state in an adjacent room. Matthew ran to his mother only to find her in this unresponsive state from which he couldn't wake her. Once she partially regained her senses, Nancy headed to the boy's bedroom, but before reaching the room heard a cross between a loud screech and a door slamming, and Matthew was no longer beside her. Now alone in the home with only the grandmother Marion, who stayed at home while Nancy began to frantically search their 80-acre horse farm on horseback, where she eventually spotted them from the Appalachian Trail. Tom and Matthew were about 15 feet away from each other on a wide dirt path, eyes locked on one another, heavily shaken and in need of care. According to Nancy, the boys were visibly suffering from shock. She stated Tom was not responding at all. Their mother and grandmother gave them fluids, wiped the boys down with washcloths and wrapped them in warm blankets. As they did so, Tom sat staring at a metal bottle top that Matthew was toying with, watching as it reacted strangely to his brother's touch. The adults watched over the boys until they dozed off on the living room sofas next to a fire. The later encounter of 1969 involved 4 members of the Reed family, and the night that would finally drive them to sell their home, property and the restaurant, the Village on the Green. Nancy, Marion, Tom and Matthew were headed home following a horse show at about 8 o'clock at night when they observed what Marion referenced to a bright, floating strip mall above the left side of the station wagon. The family spoke of what was felt to be some sort of force, a tingling vibe running through their bodies, before their car coasted to a stop off the right side of the road. Only the sounds of stones tapping under the bumper walls of their car were heard, followed by a dead silence. A barometric change in pressure was also felt before a deafening eruption of katydids and crickets. The family has collectively been able to reconstruct and piece together much of that night in 1969. Tom's recollection is one of disturbing accounts of a large dark room and long brightly illuminated hallways under a body encompassing chamber or cylinder and crying out for one another. Many have asked how the beings appeared, and there has been a lot of speculation on the terminology. Tom has described the beings which were witnessed as being genetically engineered or manufactured intelligent insect-type beings with some human characteristics, such as hands that would stand on 2 feet and vary from 3 to 5 feet in height. After their return to the vehicle, the family experienced a period of disorientation, where it was said that the car was facing a different direction than when it had come to a stop earlier. Thomas ran to his grandmother, who was wandering aimlessly in the middle of the road. Nancy, cataleptic, in the passenger seat, but she'd been driving earlier, and Matthew was unconscious in the fetal position in the back seat. Several years later, Nancy married Howard Reed and recounted her family's history with UFOs and non-human entities as far back as 1954 in Moosehead Lake, Maine. This ran in stark contrast to Howard's political aspirations, the position he held in local office and his high standing in the community. By the 1980s, Tom's father, attorney Howard Reed, PhD, met attorney Robert Bletchman, who became Tom's personal attorney and spent years reviewing the Reed case, even locating corresponding reports and supportive testimony to include several dozen witnesses. Robert discovered supporting documentation, including an incident in August of 1969 where a Heineken valet rating was assigned to a South Egremont Country Club case that placed a craft over the Reeds' property. In 1992, the Reeds case would assist Bletchman by adding credible and corroborated testimony to include the Reeds' statement on the barometric change in pressure, electromagnetic vibe, calming state and the manipulation of gravity, all of which was voiced in support of the cases by Robert at the United Nations Symposium on October 2nd, 1992. The objectives of the symposium was to introduce substantiated cases to motivate the UN to reconsider 33/426. 33/426 references an establishment of an agency or a department of the United Nations for undertaking, coordinating and disseminating the results of research into unidentified flying objects. This came 10 days before NASA began SETI's microwave observing project, the MOP/HRMS. This United Nations mention was a testament to the calibre and the seriousness of the Reed case. What prompted the Reed case to resurface after several decades were the brothers' encounters 40 years later. The evidence in the encounter of March 30th, 2009 involving Matthew in Brownsburg, Indiana was investigated by those in law enforcement as well as aerospace groups. Matthew's SUV instrument panel was found to be damaged. Matthew was missing time and there was blood on his steering wheel and shirt. A rather high amount of radiation was detected and verified. Magnetic fields were also witnessed and recorded on video. This magnetism would spin a compass needle from a distance of 2 feet. Officer White, a detective with over 30 years law enforcement experience, worked the case and reported it as authentic encounters with an unknown powerful force. Robert Bigelow, the founder of Bigelow Aerospace, had recently financed an organisation and teams to investigate CE3 and CE4 cases, such as the Reed case. Additional organisations also researched the Reed case, such as the STAR team and smaller third-party groups. All investigating personnel came to the same conclusion and validated the radiation, magnetic anomalies, as well as medical records, statements and testimony. Thomas's recent encounter would also be investigated by Detective White, who also in 2010 took Tom to advanced polygraph. Tom passed his polygraph test on his family's encounters, which covered a broad spectrum of events dating back to 1966 with a score of over 99.1. which was administered by a 30-year veteran police officer at the Department of Defence Polygraph Institute Advanced Polygraph. Note: in 2006, Howard voiced his interest in a collective book project on the family's experience with vessels and other life forms to include a compilation of sensitive material gathered over the years. Howard suffered an untimely death by a virus of unknown origin on October 2nd. This was 14 years to the day after the Reed's case was mentioned at the United Nations Symposium back in October 2nd, 1992. The CDC, on sweeping Howard's office, reported finding a vial containing the deadly virus in his air conditioning unit. The building was closed and remains closed to this day. October the 6th was then proclaimed a day of remembrance in Howard's honour by the city of Bridgeport, Connecticut, as he was strongly supported by Senator Christopher Dodd. A PhD who released his test results regarding the Reed case after evaluating family members on September 15, 2010, was also found dead on November 12, 2010, just 8 weeks later. In memory of Tom's father, a commemorative bench can be seen in the city green. Thomas Reed was a South Beach fashion photographer and the founder of Miami Models, with clients like Polo, Black Label, Tommy Hilfiger and Ralph Lauren. He held positions in upper management with companies Honeywell and Entergy. Several of Tom's childhood sketches from 1969 depicted what he witnessed firsthand involving his encounters, and they're displayed at the Roswell UFO Museum. Tom was not the only child to draw renderings, as many of the children penciled what they had seen, which also hung next to Tom's beneath the chalkboard in his 4th grade classroom. The family members share the same blood type, O rhesus negative and A rhesus negative.